'Tis said there was once a man who knew the secret, and who decided he might try to talk about it in some manner publicly to others. And since it was obvious that he couldn't do so directly, sat down and considered the various things he could talk about openly, and began to mull over them as he said their names. Let's see. Art, beauty, chance, customs, desire, duty, education, family, fate, good and evil, government, history, honor, justice, knowledge, language, law, and life and death, and logic, love, and memory and imagination, and nature, and religion, philosophy, science, time, space, and virtue, the truth, history, and wealth, and yeah, I guess that about covers it. And experiencing that pleasurable fatigue that comes from a job well done, he lay down to take a nap and sleep on the matter, and hoped it would be a long nap. No. Query: does the chance for escape remain just as open if you continue to talk about it all the time? Doze on, young troopers, doze on. Thinking can lead you to white bread, but without the addition of something slippier, you'll never get a sandwich down. To show you the power of some things, for years one man struggled against a certain automatic aspect of himself. But as soon as he stopped struggling, it resumed just as automatically and forcefully as before. Kind of gives you something to look forward to if you quit, don't it? Perhaps yet another reason mystic players never keep score. One man who had spent many years involved with various methods intended to expand consciousness says he's made such strenuous efforts that now he has lower back pain of the mind. One man threw out all of his books, TV, stereo, and CDs. He's now attempting to super weather strip his doors and windows to keep any more of the world from getting in. Local conditions once tried to clue one man in by telling him that if you don't pick on life, he won't pick on you. But the man said it was far too late for that now. A boy looked up from his studies and asked his father, "Why do they call it the art of psychology and not the science of?" And the old man thought, at last an easy one. Then said, "Because no one knows what they're doing." And the lad asked, "Is that true of all art?" And the elder replied, "Only if you attempt to practice it in public." How to stop an ordinary person from trying to talk to you. Ask them how they know what they're going to say next. And a fellow over in the corner said, "Yeah, I tried that on myself once. And it, well, boy, I mean, just doing it made me, well, you know." According to legend, there was once a mystical school which called the aim by the name of the regeneration, and employed a two-level teaching, wherein at the first level you attempted to think about the regeneration all the time, while in the second level you never thought much about it at all. And of course, as you should know by now, there was also a third secret level, which was graduation. For years, one man struggled with his poor attention and memory by writing notes to himself. Then got so good that he could overlook the notes. We will not inquire this time as to who thinks they understand this one right and who has doubt. When it comes right down to the matter of the awakening, everybody wants a system to accomplish it, more than they do to actually do it. Why is that, Professor Weingart? That's obvious, Bobby. It's because everyone thinks, at least in the beginning. Gee, thanks, Professor, for clearing that up. Not a problem, Bobby, not a problem. Now, pop quiz time. Was the title of that item, The Awakening, Apparent Systems Devoted Thereto in the Matter of Thinking, or Distraction? And if the latter, did it work? As per one version, life told Adam that he could stay in the garden and be a baby all of his life, or else leave and grow up. A viewer writes, I like versions of things that don't upset me. According to yet another version, when Adam left the garden, he had to turn in his stapler for gem clips. And that same viewer rewrites, I said I don't like to be upset. And now for some sports results. If certainty is the name of the game, then how are humans to ever score? And at an event being held in another time zone, one of the announcers covering it said to his colleague, well, Rocky, I did predict an upset. The key words here being in another time zone. Whilst lounging restful in the middle of a large library, one man gazed about and mused, you know, you can write a book about anything. When it comes to the matter of ordinary thinking, the key word to keep in mind is recycling. After many years of effort, one man could sometimes go to sleep with fleas and wake up with fleas, while at other times he'd go to sleep with fleas and wake up with roaches. Then at other times he'd try to go to sleep with fleas with the intention of waking up with them, and sometimes he would. And sometimes he wouldn't. What would you guess would be the title of this piece? Sleep? Fleas? Intention? One man thought he was suffering from excessive water retention, but it turned out just to be him. One day a man asked himself, if the mind is a tunnel and thoughts a train running through it, then who's responsible for laying the tracks right there? One man used to privately refer to himself as, you simple, stupid son of a bitch, but finally got so good that he'd respond, who are you talking to? We will not, in this instance, either inquire into who does or does not believe they get it. Finally, clearly defined, intellectuals. Those who believe that they're directed by their intellect. The key words here being who believe that. The simple believe in faraway fantastic miracles, while the more alert find it miraculous that they're simply able to sometimes remember what it is they started out to do. One man finally entitled his life, quoting, everything you need to know about transformation and regeneration is in you, but it takes most of your life to dig it out, and most people don't last that long. Erratums and corrections. I reported you recently about a race of beings on one world whose concept of God was a plain sharp stick poked directly in your eye. Well, it turns out that the info was incorrect. This is not their conception of God, but rather of something else. Now back to today's news. One man said to himself, what can you think about but thoughts? And finding this unacceptable, he never said it to himself again. But that didn't stop it from still happening. A man wrote the, oh, is that a major body wound you have there, doctor? And asked, is there actually any way to keep things from happening? And the doctor fired off an abrupt reply. One legend has it that there were actually two first men, an Adam and a shadow Adam. And while all the descendants of the former remain in the dark, a certain secret has been handed down in the latter's line. Indeed. All ordinary human pursuits appear to have identifiable motivational factors, such as with the desire for fame or for wealth, etc. But where is such in the fused pursuit of the mystical transformation? Forget how difficult it is to get people interested in learning hog calling, who have no interest in having hogs. Turn the consideration on your own natural self and mind and realize just how little interest they have in any effort to radically change their condition. Kind of gives you something spooky to look forward to, huh? Would-be intellectuals fret over the collective making heroes of whoever can jump the highest. And those who jump the highest worry over who gets paid the most for doing it. And those who are paid the most wish they could be perceived as intellectuals. The movement of man never stops. As he reflected on his attempted assaults on himself thus far, one man thought, if, as they claim, the first cut is the deepest, then I'm either already bled to death or lacking the ability to feel pain. Yes, I know they say that the longest journey begins with one step, but those who say that have never tried to get to Istanbul. Well, either that or they have more time available than normal people do. One man got everything all mixed up, but it worked out okay since everyone else had everything just right. All sheepdrops should be pleased to live in an ocean. Ah, and so they are, Captain Gherkins. They just don't realize it. A man and a crow were sitting on a log, and the man said to the bird, what do you figure is the advantage of being in a fable as opposed to real life? And as the crow was suddenly and miraculously able to understand language, it replied, you picked a hell of a time to ask me. The ring announcer declared, let all in favor say yay, and all opposed nay. Now shake hands and go back to being one. News from the kitchen. After all's been thought, chewed, and swallowed, talks the automatic dishwasher. Or is that food disposal? Now for some good news. As long as you take life as you find it to be serious and important, you've got nothing to worry about. Ask me this addendum. Just who would find the above to be good news? Him? Her? Them? Surely not you. After many years of sampling various mystical systems, one man says he now has a mental yeast infection. When this one man knew that he wasn't going anywhere, he'd sometimes make sounds vun, vun, like a revved up motorcycle. His mind loved this, since what I was talking about was not going anywhere mentally. Whenever he'd think about it, this one guy would think, what a shame. I assume you'd know that he was thinking about his thinking. Okay, extreme form of a previous definition. Intellectuals, people who want to stop the merry-go-round, with no idea what they'll do after that. One guy told another guy, you sure do annoy me. Another guy said, yeah, but not half as much as I do myself. And the first guy said, so, is that supposed to make me feel better? Another guy said, yeah, but not half as much as it should me. One version of the legend says that when Socrates visited the oracle at Delphi, the first thing she did was poke him in the eye with a sharp stick. Only the few can fruitfully pursue a book. Only the few can fruitfully peruse a book with no title or conclusion. Read it, think it, then do it. Stories are for children, sharp sticks for adults, alert adults. One man carried a machine around with him, and sometimes he'd get so tired of it that he'd stop thinking about it. But still, he dragged the thing around with him. Interrogatory interruption. Should this item make you feel discouraged, wary, encouraged, or something far beyond any of the above? One man would periodically give himself a breast examination. He says he knows he doesn't have breasts, but he hopes that by using this ploy he'll be able to keep himself from looking anywhere else, especially higher up. The mental activity of those seeking the transformation comes down to a most simple matter. You're either thinking about that or else you're thinking about bullshit stuff. What could be simpler? As the tidal wave again was poised to strike land, he stood there to his knees, anchored in the sand. After achieving an extreme familiarity with himself, one man one day stood back and took a good look at what he hoped had become an estranged version of himself and said, "Thank God it's too late now to make up." I hope. Yeah. And if you're right, so every time you tell a story about someone and do not identify him any more specifically than just one man, I get so disturbed I have to rush to the mirror to see if it's me. One of the more salient chapters in the invisible history of mysticism concerns the number of men who undertook the quest only to eventually give up, only to then become teachers of the mystical. Yeah. Just like any good marketplace, a little something for everybody. And just like any good warrior will say, "I don't want no something." While alone, in a seductive mood, one man said to himself, "How'd you like me to give you some head?" And his mind replied, "Geez, I thought you'd never ask." After considerable observation of his rhetorical output, one man concluded that he suffered from a verbal bladder control problem. One man's pet name for his thoughts was, "Yeah." And if you're right, I was going to write and say that I wish you wouldn't patronize me, but upon further reflection, I'm not sure that's possible, considering my present position and all. A couple of thugs were plotting to do away with a certain mystic, and one of them said, "What should we do? Kill him?" And another of the nefarious countered, "Nah, just make him take a name." And all of them had a good, hearty, and really aggressive laugh at that one. Awakening unexpectedly in the middle of the night one night, a chap suddenly sat up in bed and exclaimed, "Mein Gott, I'm full of thugs." Shortly after the carnival had opened for the day, one of the showmen cupped his hands and cried out, "I want to invite any in attendance here today who feel they have any interest whatsoever in my personal life and affairs to feel free to step into my tent over here and take a royal bite of my ass." Without any warning, one man suddenly awoke one night and leapt from the bed screaming, "Mamma mia, my insides are a flaming midway." "'Tis alleged that on one world they think of the mystical as being kind, caring, and all around charitable. 'Tis further alleged that this world is a sham, shallow version of their real one. Upon close examination of himself, one man concluded, "Yes, I smell exactly like myself. In fact, too much so." The reason that the ordinary are forced to think about all the meaningless things they do is so that the future will have a chance. During the process of checking out several mystical schools to see which one he might like to join, a man asked the head of one with which he had found some favor, "Are you sure you don't have just a small cancer?" A man wrote the glaring doctor and asked, "Can't the mystical itself fall into the trap of excessive self-reference?" But the doctor found this far too self-evident to bother responding to. Well, either that or he just couldn't come up with a response. One man said, "Thank God it's Friday," to which his brother countered, "Nay, premature, merely preparatory. You really mean Saturday." And a second brother demurred, "No, you did not go far enough. It should be Sunday, a time of respite and repose." Then their father stepped in and said, "You all missed it. Your attention should be on Monday, the beginning of all of it, all over again." You don't live on the cutting edge unless you think on the cutting edge. And someone asked, what would be thinking on the cutting edge? Any thinking beyond your present. When one man learned what had happened to him, he wrote and said, "I'm just sick about it." Then there was this other guy who sent himself a get well card in care of Life.
No.
Life didn't think it was funny. One man got all of his ideas from somewhere else. One man is all men. One man got all his ideas from somewhere else. All ideas are from somewhere else. One man got all his ideas from somewhere else. You're surrounded by somewhere else. A father said to his son, "Let me in conclusion say this to you. There is a place within a man's system where such as this cannot be said. If the active pursuit of a mystical system does not lead to its explosion, then the system leads nowhere." In one legend, the greatest knight of them all was Sir Forgot-a-Lot. While in most, of course, it is good king always remembering. You untangle it. Interplanetary warning. Never trust a machine with one eye. One man says, probably the absolute hardest thing in the world to do is to describe what this kind of effort is all about. And the second man says, "You mean to others?" And the first man says, "Hell, to yourself." On one world, life subconsciously tells everyone the moment they're born that, "Okay, I expect you to be good and brain dead by 20. You hear?" A viewer writes, "I notice that sometimes you refer to what you're involved in as this kind of thing, and at other times as this kind of effort. What is the distinction?" Ultimately, it is the supreme distinction. And finally, question. What's more rare than finding a 50-year-old mystic with all of his own teeth? Answer, finding a 50-year-old mystic. I was going to pick up a piece of where I stopped last time, and just to refresh anybody thinking about it, to consider man, and I was specifically responding to the kinds of letters I've gotten throughout the years from people who have seen this and people who've read some of the things I'd written, and would ask about some specific known, nameable, so-called mystical system. And rather, as I was pointing out last time, rather than them asking someone's opinion, mine or anyone's, what they think of it, it would be better served if they ask themselves, what do they understand of what they're involved with? The answer being they don't really understand much, or they wouldn't be asking someone else's opinion. And I was pointing out that in the so-called world of mystical systems and efforts, there's always been readily identifiable three approaches. And the first one, the simplest, it just takes man without any great discrimination as just this physical being. And you could just call it the first approach. And the second gets a bit more specific, and you could say is more or less directed at the limbic system in man's nervous system and what appears to be the emotions. This first approach is just the body in general. And then the third tries to get a bit more specific, to go into the whole area of man's mind, the intellect. They all overlap. They've all had their heyday. They all still have their heyday. There are places in the world, you can certainly look at it the way I numbered it, as being a kind of non-linear progression, although when I describe it or number it, it apparently is self-denying because it appears to be sequential by calling it 1, 2, and 3. But as you always say out there in TV land, we that is at bay. You could say that the first part of taking just the body in general is the more simplistic approach. There are right now still pockets of people, groups of tribes, groups of people on this planet that their main approach to the mystical, although they might be calling it religious, but the mystical is almost entirely directed toward the body. Their rituals, their worship consists primarily of rhythm and dancing, just jumping up and down, just rhythm. If they really get sophisticated, they might add a bit of music off of a single note flute. But the simplistic approach is that they are, as far as they're concerned, man is just simply the body. And remind you again that it does overlap, and it does not mean that no one will ever bring up the idea of emotions or the idea of what people think, but they treat man just as this fairly simplistic physical creature, not that far removed from the animal world. And when you're dealing with people at that level, as you should know, if you haven't done it personally, you can see it historically, that they feel a very close relationship to the animal kingdom. And they'll very often that their shaman, their priest, whoever's running the mystical, will clothe themselves in a leopard skin, a buffalo hide. They do not feel that removed from the other physical entities on this planet. I had moved up then to the second, reminding you again, it is not as sequential as it sounds because it still goes on, and such as that first group that I said that there are people, actually groups of people that still fit the classification that their whole approach to mysticism is almost entirely toward man, the simplistic body, just a physical creature. But also remember that there are people in the midst of more sophisticated areas, such as right here, who individually, that is in their own nervous system, still are part of that same approach. That is where their interest would be. So it's not just a group of people. It is not just external and so many manifestations of civilization or societal progress. It just simply is, because there are people in the midst of more advanced areas, societally speaking, who are nonetheless still fairly simplistic in their approach to what would amount to mystical, to the mystical approaches. The second group, just roughly I was describing as what's usually referred to in the West as the spiritual. But it is aimed at the emotions of man. And the third is aimed at the mind. And by the way, to remind you again, also if you'll notice, all three approaches are based upon the belief, in all three cases, that there is a certain aspect of man that must be brought under control. The first being that just man in general, that physically he must in some way be brought under control, that he must bring his physical life. The most simplistic description of it is perhaps that you'd find a group or a person, but let's say a group makes it easier to describe, whose approach toward the mystical is still treating man almost as just one step removed from the animal kingdom. And they treat him as though they treat the idea of some mystical transformation or regeneration, that being the mystical, that man can transform himself, that the transformation in this case is really that physically he has strayed too far from a natural, damn near animalistic life, and that their rituals and etc., that they will drum themselves into a trance, or they'll dance themselves into a stupor, perhaps with a bit of liquid refreshments that have lain about in fermenting kegs for an appropriate length of time. But it is as though they treat him as though something has happened to him. They don't look at it as the mind, but it's just that in some way he has drifted from a previously more natural state, and that he must bring himself back into alignment. That by becoming somewhat civilized, by becoming somewhat intellectual, no matter what terms they use, they just look at, even them not having those sorts of people would not be those who would be followers of modern day interpretation of Christianity, so they may not have the story of Adam and Eve, but you understand in their own version they're going to have some story of creation wherein the original man their archetypical man in some way strayed from the path that the gods laid down for all the good beasts on the planet, laid down for man, and they all got various stories. In some way he drifted away. He learned how to talk. He started hanging out in cities. He got too big for his britches. He just got too smart. And so now the whole point of the mystical, the whole point of transforming man, is to bring this non-aligned, speaking animalistically, just physically, biologically, to bring this non-aligned part of man back into alignment. And as some of you may know, right here on the cusp of the 21st century, we're having, in the Western world, especially America, a revised interest in things of native, as they refer to it as the Native American mysticism here. That, boy, man has just simply gone astray. He should be back living as our forefathers did. He should be back living. Well, he should take a lesson from the eagles and the buffaloes and, well, perhaps not creatures that down there got extinct, but you understand the gist of it. And so they involve themselves in rituals that are really to physically realign the man with no great theory involved, no great dogma, and that's that. The second part I was trying to get to, and I was saying that it is, no matter how they described it, it is aimed at man's emotions, that they feel it a bit more specifically. And as always, it is certainly not separate. It is not discrete from the first group, because I even identified it physically down to what is generally referred to as man's limbic system, which you could just look at as being sort of a bridge point between the completely uncivilized and the minimally so. But it's still part of man's nervous system, so they're in no wise an absolute discrete entity from the first group. But it does track the general sequential civilized progression of man, in that the first group, people who would have been just working on the body, just looked at man as being a physical creature, perhaps one step removed from animals, then if they progress along far enough, given enough length of time, the right kind of circumstances, they will someday come up and get a bit more specific, rather than just looking at it as being man has physically, animalistically, biologically drifted from the correct path, that he must be brought back under control. That they look at it a bit more specifically, and they will identify it in his emotional life. That not just that he's strayed from the natural course that the gods intended for all physical creatures to live on this planet, but they identify it as a bit more specific. That now that he has strayed so far, they don't even look at it as any longer that we should go back, that we have to move back that way just to physically bring ourselves closer to the animal form of existence. They look at it more specifically that what is now, that man has gone too far. I mean, it's too far to use the first approach, that he is now an urban, civilized, talkative, sophisticated, intellectual creature of some kind. And now the problem is the kinds of emotions that have gone along with that. That is, man is now greedy, for instance. Whereas they do not look at squirrels trying to hoard up nuts for the winter as being greedy. That is natural. But the second approach would now say, but we've gone far beyond that. Man has now become so lax, so fat, so sophisticated, so urbanized, that he now wants to collect more nuts than he can ever eat. That is, he's greedy. He wants to accumulate wealth. And they'll turn around and say, look here in our own village, look in our own city. We have people who are going hungry, and we have people who have more money. That is, more food's all it represents. They have more food than they can ever consume. If they ate 24 hours a day, they would never eat up the kinds of money they've gotten. It's greed. It serves no purpose. I mean, they go around and strut and try to show off to those who don't have it, but it serves no purpose. That's just one. And so the most common, I was putting the name on it myself, description, but the most general description of that kind of secondary approach is that they attempt to direct the would-be followers to that kind of mystical approach to lead them into good works. And it may take the form, well, it always takes some form of external charitable acts. But they say that it is to create some sort of spiritual, that is, some sort of internal transformation in the person engaging in the good acts and the good deeds. And about where we left off, I didn't get to finish up last time, was I was pointing out that this idea of charity is all of this is. If you can see behind it, there was at one time a kind of very hard-nosed reality to it. There is in fact, you could look at as an absolutely transcendental approach to all of these, if I ever get around to wrapping in the third one, but of all of these, which swallows them all, and the original intention behind them all was the same. But in the works, in the idea of doing charitable works, specifically, those of you who can recall, I wanted to pick up, if they had understood it, well, I'll go ahead and explain it to you. The original intent was like this: to get a man to do charitable, to do good deeds for others, for you to be directed into, well, go over there and find out what those people need and give them, help them. They're the ones in need. That's your duty. That's your job. This is our method to try and bring about some sort of spiritual transformation. Go and do the good works. Do charitable deeds. The intent was like this: for a man to go attempt to do that. That is, he is now submitting whatever he thinks he desires and needs to the needs and desires of someone else. That's what charity is, that you go and you give them, you do for them what they say they need, not what you think they need. You are fulfilling their wishes and not yours. But what's not understood is, if this was used correctly, the purpose was this: for a certain kind of man to continue to do that until it suddenly struck him that it don't make a damn. That is, I have given up my desires and my wishes to suit them under one guise, like, well, God wants you to, or whatever story they get you started in, like we just do good works. That's the basis of our mystical approach. But the real transformation and understanding should have been, or could have been, the day that a man realized, here he spent X amount of months or years every day faithfully going out, and here's these other people with whom he has no real contact. They're not family, they're just strangers, and he is finding out what they want. They say they need, and he tries to give it to them. He works on their behalf to fulfill their wishes instead of his own. Until one day it strikes him, I have given up my desires, looking after my interests now, let's say for 20 years. You know, what a great sacrifice I've been thinking it was for 20 years, and it suddenly struck me, it don't make a goddamn. It doesn't mean it's nothing. Which then simply shows that a man's ordinary desires are illusionary. We're not talking about physical desires now. That which he thinks he desires and needs from life, they're illusionary. And I say illusionary, not that they do not seem real enough to you, but the point of doing charitable works and trying to submit to the needs of others is however long it took. It might not take 20 years, but you understand, I'm putting the words in the guy's, my fictitious examples I'm putting in his head. There he is, him thinking, getting up for the first day of his 20th year. Well, here I go again. 20 years it's been now that I gave up all of my dreams. I gave up, by and large, what I thought I wanted out of life, my desires, and I get up every day for 20 years now, and I go out there and I find out what these strangers want. I find out what it is they say they need, and I do it while suppressing, while ignoring my own. But let's say the first day of the 20th year, while he's thinking that, while he's getting dressed and getting out of bed, it suddenly strikes him, yes, I've done that. So it doesn't matter worth a damn. See, there's no way to explain that. That's why I went into dramatics. But that was the basis of it, to realize that if I had been for 20 years, instead of devoting my energy to the needs and wishes of others, trying to fulfill what they say is their wishes and their needs, if I'd done my own, things would not be a bit different. I would not be any different than I am now. There, for a man who was wired up enough to really want this journey, that would have been worth 20 years. Because when you realize that all of the ordinary desires a man has, all his wishes are imaginary, then you've got a big ergo. The big ergo is, if that's true, then my personality is the same thing. That's worth 20 years of effort to a real would-be mystic. Into the third area. Since if I don't do it now, I'll probably never do it. The third area is, relatively speaking, again, keeping in mind that they all overlap, they're all still alive, but within an apparent sequential description and history of it, the third one is the latter, the latest, because the development of man's intellect is later. In fact, when you're alive, you know the development, even the appearance of your intellect in any discernible form is several years behind the development and the appearance of your body and your emotions. So this third approach is the younger. It attempts to take into account man's mind, but it still is based upon, as I point out, the first two, that there is something in man that has got to be brought under control for him to personally be transformed in some way. You might also note that all three of these approaches ignore the fact that life is running along quite well with man just as is. But that serves no purpose to ordinary people to point that out. I was going to say maybe no more than it did for you, but I'm sure that's not true. You just knew I was going to say it, and so. The third approach is, so you can understand, relatively speaking, not only newer, but of much less significance. And I know nobody's going to particularly care for this one, but it's of much less significance for the same reason that man's intellect is of much less significance than his other two parts. Hey, it's fair, but it's hard. There are certainly identifiable or self-identifiable mystical groups that specifically state that they are working on the man's mind. And historically, perhaps the greatest, as I mentioned, was the Tibetan form of Buddhism, is how it started, and it became the idea of the liberation of the mind, that their methods, their approaches were intended to, they call it liberation of the mind, which is another way of saying to corral, to bring under control man's mind as it is now. It is not limited to just that, but just in the realms of the classically referred to, or in the classically referred to realms of mysticism, that is perhaps the best known, that and the Western notion of Zen. But now it has even overlapped in the West into specific areas of academia, such as psychology. And I say that as opposed to psychiatry, not the actual treatment of neural disorders, neural maladies, but psychology as opposed to psychiatry. That right now, many forms, many of the most popular forms in schools, as they're called, of psychology now, are tinged, to say the least, many of them, with mystical over and undertones. And some of them just blatant. And in other areas of academia, they're in anthropology, and there's subdivision, I guess, in that of those men, women specializing in mythology, of no longer looking at such matters as being just a cold, objective area for academic study, but in fact that they may be of some use to people nowadays, actual value, some use to try and translate the myth, to try and translate from the dead ashes and relics in archaeology of things that people were doing, thinking, attempting mentally at other times, that they could be applicable now, that some seem so foreign and yet so close and native to man. But at any rate, let me jump specifically into the sorts of things. The first group, and as I was pointing out that in the West, would probably be most identifiable nowadays if you just said yoga to people in the West. They go, yeah, doing the postures. And there are certain other things. You could even include the kinds of trance dancing from Sufism, some of the African forms of mysticism. But what they're attempting to do, they're trying to take man just as a simple, fairly simple, and I say fairly simple just again, just a little bit more complex than the creatures, the beasts of the planet, the other beasts. As they take man and then look at it as him being possibly capable of a transformation, but on the basis that he has got to corral, he's got to bring under control his physical life in general. That you just cannot stumble around in life doing everything you want to, sleeping all the time you want to. And the more simplistic they are, the closer they are to the kind of archetypical example that would fit my classification, the closer they are, or the less likely they are to pick out things specifically and say, well, it's bad to overeat because the head shaman may be fat. It's just that in general, the closer it is, you understand, to the first group, the closer it is, the less specific they are that you must do so-and-so. It's just in general to say, well, we're just a little out of kilter, we're a little out of touch, we're a little misaligned from walking this natural path that we should, like our other good beasts, our brothers. That we look around at lines and we do not see lines having inner pride battles to the point of death. In other words, they'll be saying here in the village sometimes we'll get mad at one another and kill each other. And lions, they'll simply bare their teeth, make a few sounds, and everything's all right. That we are simply out of touch. We have strayed from the natural path. So then the methods are, such as just jumping up and down, a rhythm, just to the point that it just puts you into a trance. And all that does, in one sense, is calm down whatever it is that was going on. And the more you would participate, the more that you were wired up to take part in that, the more, if you were living in a group of people that were more or less still limited to that kind of simplistic, just body approach, the more it would have an effect on you. That if you did come there, that say once a month they had a big kind of tribal spiritual meeting to try and bring people, get them more in a line, you'd get there. Like I said, sometimes it's encouraged, helped along by certain drugs or alcohol, but even if not given that, if you come there and they all just they start playing, and everybody in the village, they stand there together, a good tribal feeling, collective feeling, and everybody begins to jump. And you let that go on. If you're the type, remember, it's not that any of this objectively will work on every person, but if you are in that condition, in those circumstances, and you participate, that feels right, that's what you do, and you're part of the tribe, the village, given a few hours of that, and you can very likely feel as though you're in a different state. And whatever was bothering you, let's say that you were mad at your wife, you've been having a fight with your wife or husband, or you've been arguing with a neighbor over who owns that cow out there, whose calf it is now that she's calved, whatever it is, and you do this, and it's as though you almost flatline man's humanity almost back to the primal feral level. Not feral in the sense of being uncontrollable, but back to a primal level wherein internally you're not that agitated, that you do not feel that far removed from an animal. Not in a dangerous sense, because they do not do it to create more danger, they do it to create more peace and quiet. The simple description of the second group is, like I said, the active side, you can look at it as their attempt to do charitable works, to do good. As far as a specific mystical approach, this gets tricky because, as I said, the first two are very closely aligned. But probably in the West, well, all over the world, probably the easiest way to describe a general approach or general method within that second approach is prayer and worship. Prayer gets a little sticky because some of the groups, more than others, can feel as though the words of the prayer are important and of prime significance, which moves it closer to the third area, whereas some of them use prayer such as chanting, such as the idea of chanting a mantra or just a sound in worship to God, or just repeating, or just standing going, Allah, 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 or whatever it is, that the purpose, they believe, is to bring man's stray emotions, to bring our ungodly, our undesirable, our emotions unworthy of humans, to bring them under control, because it seems as though you are focusing your attention, and not just here, because they give very little account to this specifically, but as though you're focusing your attention on the possibility of man's higher emotions, or conversely to clean up the ones he has now, to bring them under control. That if he could bring under control his greed, his lust, now not sex itself, but the undesirable parts of sex, the parts of trying to take your neighbor's wife, that sort of thing. In the same way as greed. It's not that greed's based upon the desire to survive, and so they don't say, well, to go without food, but their approach is, you don't need all that food. You don't need all that money. Share it with other people. Devote your life to something else. Don't keep collecting more money. You'll never spend all that. You'll never eat it all. And so that kind of second approach is based upon, forget how well understood it is, which amounts to close to, but is based upon the approach that a man could possibly be transformed. There's a possibility of transformation, but it would be through bringing his emotions as they are naturally. And they always have some story of how he got flawed emotionally. But it's to bring them under control. And if you pray, if you will sit and meditate, you might just go and sit in whatever house of worship they have, and you look at a candle, you look at an icon of their God, you look at some focus point of worship, or you just try to sit and think, God is good, God is good, God is good. Or you could be thinking, I'm no good, I'm no good, I'm no good. It's all the same thing. The attempt is based upon trying to bring the emotions under control. Now, in line with this, and I could be describing this in other ways, but they are all truly, that's one of the widest ranging usable descriptions, is that all these approaches are all based upon the belief that there is something out of control in man that's keeping him, or does keep him, from any possibility of a transformation. That we can't even speak of a transformation until we get this problem under control. And the first group sees it kind of as just a general problem of man being man instead of no longer being just simply a primate who happens to be able to speak. And the second group sees it as he is now, way beyond the idea of a primate who can just speak, he is now a singular species, but he has singular problems, and the singular problems are in his emotions, which only come out, you might notice, once man has collected in a group. Because who cares if you're out living by yourself? You could be greedy and lustful, and it doesn't matter. Which, of course, brings up a side interesting question you might find. Nobody ever considers it, but in no religion that's ever existed on this planet, can a man be a sinner if he never sees anyone else. If you live alone, it's not possible to be a real active sinner. It's just... But the third group, which might be most identifiable to people in the West today as Zen, the Western idea of Zen, or certain aspects of Sufism, but is the idea, the classic one of Zen, of just sitting, and forget all the posture and that there's something real important to that, but is the point of just, the approach is to try and just sit yourself still physically. Now, it's not going to do anything immediately to the emotions or the mind. But the third group has identified more specifically that the thing to be brought under control, forget the emotions, forget the body in general, is we got to get this under control. And in some way they may or may not try to describe it, that there will be some sort of trickle-down theory that this will finally encompass and bring the others under control, because their feeling is, it's based upon the third group, that is, that they have progressed even further. And so their main point of focus is the mind, which is quite natural. They see that as now being the paramount jewel in man's nervous system, and, as always, the seat of the largest problems. The source of the largest problems is the mind. And so forget the body and all that. That would take care of itself. That this is what must be brought under control. And so then the point is to sit. Is how all that started, in case you can't figure it out, but is to take care of the first kind of approach. Is sit down and be still. Okay. Now it does not stop. The emotions in there from jumping around does not stop the mind. But you first sit, but then they more specifically point out that the mind is what must be brought under control. And there is no great way to do it. They've tried, the koans for one thing, is to give the mind something to do that if you try to do it, it makes the mind suddenly go boom. And you think, what the hell is that? It is almost the same thing as trying to do charitable works. It's to do good deeds for others until you find out, I've been doing good deeds for others at my own expense. And hell, it doesn't make a goddamn. It's kind of like trying to figure out one of these koans about the one hand, clapping the sound. You think, I'm giving up my own sanity and reason to try to deal with this kind of, silliness. Until one day it strikes a man, as they call it in Zen, the awakening, is you realize, well, yeah, I have. I've given up my own reason, my good judgment, my good rational thoughts for 20 years trying to screw around with this thing that doesn't make any sense and completely irrational, and suddenly it strikes you, I didn't give up anything. It's no worse than what I would have been doing. Well, we're out of time. I might point out one other thing, like the first and second groups, especially the second, is where the concept of the grace of God comes from. And in the third group, the idea of satori, or those whom Allah decides to smile upon, or those who receive Buddhahood, receive it, and those who don't. But it's like the grace of God. Because what it was attempted to represent, the concept was, it's an admission without them understanding that sometimes this thing works. That is, prayer or whatever. Sometimes it works and sometimes it doesn't. But even when it does, nobody knows why or how. And so it's like, well, the grace of God, just do it and trust.